Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be in the world. This is Zach Ackerman, Denison's Director of Business Development, and we're about to get started for our May Consulting Network webinar. Joining me today is Dr. Dan Denison, founding partner and chairman of Denison Consulting, and with him, Michelle Mullins, our Director of Research and Development. Together, the two of them help to drive forward our products and our offerings, both to our direct clients as well as to our consulting partners who are joining us on the line today. This month, we're going to be covering our practical research into the links of organizational culture and employee engagement and some of the interesting cases that we've run into to date, and particularly over the past year. In June, we'll be talking about the links between culture and leadership and how you can utilize our tools in both culture and leadership to drive true change in your client organizations. And as always, we'll be posting recordings of all of our webinars on our website, which you can get to through the events portion of denisonconsulting.com. And any questions can be submitted throughout the webinar via the chat window. I'll be collecting them and then facilitating some Q&A at the end so that you can get answers from Dan and Michelle. Well, at least to the best of their ability. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dan and Michelle to get going on our May webinar.
Thanks, Zach. Terrific that you can all join us today. And we do promise to pass back any unanswerable questions to Zach here at the end of the webcast, too. But thanks so much for joining us. We've had a lot of change and a lot of discussion over the past couple of years on the topic of the connection between organizational culture and employee engagement, and we want to speak to that this morning. Both concepts have been around for many years, and they're obviously closely interrelated. But I think this has kind of taken a new turn recently, where we're hearing more organizations saying that they want to go deeper than just doing a employee engagement survey. They want to go broader, and that they want to have more relevance to the line management team in their organization, rather than simply reporting out percent favorable response engagement scores to the human resource community. That's the foundation, nothing wrong with that at all. But given the pace of change that you see in the marketplace today, we see organizations doing some things a little bit different. And so we wanted to kind of report out on that today and give you some examples of things that we've done and get your thoughts and reactions. So the decision about which way to go is still an important one. And the most basic difference in this is the difference between an organization level concept and an individual concept. Engagement is closely related to concepts like satisfaction and commitment. It's about the individual's connection to the organization. Well, what drives that? The work context drives it. The culture drives it. The context that people work in is what drives that. And so our work looks both at the organization culture level, at the firm level, which has grown out of our research predicting firm performance, company level performance. And we also combine that with individual measures of engagement. And, we found that's a powerful combination. The way we think about the connection between these two is represented in this next slide, that the culture, the research shows that we've done and others, is probably your best predictor of firm performance. The research on engagement and firm performance, at least in the kind of academic literature, is not very well established. There certainly is a lot of buzz about that in the marketplace, and we do believe it's absolutely essential. But it's the work context that drives, it's the culture that drives engagement, individual engagement. So we tend to look at engagement as a behavioral outcome that's a function of the culture and the work environment that people are in. That individual outcome is extremely important for predicting individual job performance. And individual job performance, of course, is the foundation for firm performance. But the way people interact and we work together and we coordinate, and the business processes and the enterprise thinking and the coordination and integration are characteristics of a culture that our research has shown are quite a bit more powerful in terms of predicting firm performance. Now, there is, of course, a close connection between the two. This comes from a study where we took kind of the 10% of organizations that had the lowest culture scores and contrasted them with the 10% of a sample that had the highest culture scores. These are the two profiles, no surprise there. But the interesting thing is that the engagement factor for these two profiles differs dramatically. For the low culture scores, engagement's at the 11th percentile, and for the high culture scores, it's the 83rd percentile. So it's closely related. We haven't done much in the way of time series analysis, but we're working on some of that now. But the correlation between these is very close. If you look at this from the client's perspective, though, here's some of the things that we've heard recently and gives us pause for thought. One executive a few years ago said, talking about culture and engagement, said, yeah, we've done engagement surveys, and I feel like I'm a contestant in the Engaged Manager of the Year contest. He saw this as kind of not closely linked to his job of actually managing the business, but was a criteria that he was, held accountable for. Yeah, it's a good thing, but in this case, it seemed like it was a little bit disconnected. The other question that we get a lot is, how do you improve engagement without focusing on the work environment, without focusing on the context, without focusing on the culture? And our answer is you probably don't. I've had the experience of a number of leaders and executives who said, well, I have low engagement scores. What do I do, given that what I have is percent favorable response on a measure of employee engagement? And that's a hard question to answer. Another comment that we get from a number of clients, 3 or 4 just in the last few months, have said that yes, they've done engagement work. It's good, it's essential, they're not about to stop, but they've said that, well, we need to go broader and deeper than just engagement to change our organization. So engagement can be a signal of where the organization needs to change. And certainly, when you get it right, you get the mission and the direction and adaptability, involvement and consistency, and all those good things that we keep measuring. Those are good predictors of individual engagement, but they also point to key areas of leverage where you can change the organization. The other theme here is that you can't delegate. It's really difficult to delegate culture change to human resources. One executive in a Finnish company that I worked with for a number of years had a engineer as a CEO that really didn't understand culture that well. Very talented guy, very good guy for us to work with. But he would keep trying to delegate culture change to the human resource executive. And at first she accepted that, but then increasingly she felt the need to push back on that. And she, developed one of the best quotes I've ever heard. She said, well, when they try to put the monkey on your back, throw it back. Because the line executives in an organization are the ones that really drive the culture. Human resources has an extremely important role in doing that. But again, leadership's a team sport. The people make the place, all the people make the place, and you can't delegate culture change to the human resource function. Michelle and I, along with Marcus Dixon and Jesse Sanchez, are working on a book chapter now, and this is one of the themes that we got in. So I pulled out a quote here, because a lot of times you find a high level of engagement in a culture that used to be, but not a high level of engagement in the culture that you want to have for the future. So is an intense level of engagement in a highly stable, inward-focused culture the best strategy for coping with a dynamic, fast-moving business environment? Probably not. How about if you're still, committed to, you're a utility, you're still committed to coal-fired power plants? Is that high level of engagement a key asset to repositioning to renewables and a strategy is sustainability? Not exactly. How about retail? Some of our most dynamic clients these past couple of years have been ones that are taking the full force of digitalization on the chin, because their whole system is designed to grow by building new stores. And that's not necessarily the way that the top firms are growing these days. They're growing because they're increasing sales per store. So anyway, this quote gives also some of the insight and overview. So what we've learned is that when organizations are trying to improve the level of engagement, they're trying to improve the competitiveness and the performance of the firm, they need to dig deeper in understanding where the points of leverage are in the culture and what needs to change in the organization so that they can become more competitive as a firm, and also so that they can continue to improve the level of engagement. So with that as an intro, I want to turn things to my friend and colleague, Michelle Mullins, who will show us some projects we've done where we have started to dig deeper with specific client organizations.
And as always, folks, please feel free to use the chat function to submit questions, which we'll take at the end.
Great. Thanks, Zach. So over to Michelle.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone. And as Dan queued up for me, we want to, first we want to give you a general overview of how we distinguish culture and engagement and how we see those impacting organizations today. But we also want to take some time and show you some of the stuff that we're talking about with organizations right now and give you some examples. And so I'm going to spend a little bit of time and walk you through just one recent analysis that we did for a client, keeping in mind that this is one client specifically. And so although I'll take note of where some of these findings we see generalizing, we don't want to take this as necessarily generalizing to everybody. But this kind of indicates how important it can be to really dig into exactly what Dan was getting at, is trying to dig into what is that context that's making a difference here. And so I'm going to start out with just the storyline, and essentially for this project or analysis, I was working with a client, and what they were actually interested initially was looking at how different demographic factors were impacting the scores of engagement. And for this particular analysis, the client was especially interested in minority status. And so what we did here was we started off and we looked at that. So we found that minority status was in fact statistically significant in predicting engagement, even when other demographic variables are considered. And so some of the other demographics that in this analysis we found predicted engagement were age, employee level, and minority status. However, if you notice, we're looking at that 5.7%, and what that means is essentially when we're taking all of these different demographic factors into account, they do significantly predict engagement for this client. However, it's only 5.7%. So in other words, if we want to try to explain this client's engagement scores, if we want to say this is what is impacting and creating these scores that you have today, well, about 5.7% of those scores we can say is explained by demographic variables. So meaningful, yes, absolutely. Something that we definitely don't want to ignore. However, that is small. And that gets right back to what exactly Dan was just talking about, is what is the context and how is culture driving that? And so as you can see, once we take culture into account, huge, drastic jump in how we can explain engagement. So we went from about 6% of engagement explained to now we can explain almost 40% of the engagement scores with this client. And so as you can see, minority status, age, employee level, they still, when taking into account culture, they were still meaningful, which means that essentially they added on, they were a part of this percentage. So even with culture, they do add on independent association, independent variance in that engagement score. However, it is very small compared to culture. And doing so allowed us to not only say that, yes, culture is important, but also we could tell them what about culture was important. And so in this case, we looked at the trait level and were able to identify that for this client, in order to drive change in engagement, their focus area should really be involvement and mission, as well as consistency. And you can see here that age also came out as a factor that was important. That's pretty high importance. On the left side, I do have those listed by how strong they were in predicting engagement. And so I'll give you a little foreshadowing now. Age comes up again. But doing so allowed us to not only say, yes, this first area of focus, demographic variables that you were interested in, they are meaningful and they are something we should consider, and definitely some areas of focus for our action planning. But also, don't forget about the context of the organization. Don't forget about what's going on as far as, especially in this case, involvement and mission, in order to truly make some changes in your engagement scores. And so from this analysis, again, as I've already mentioned, the interest was in minority status. And so for this client, we did a comparison just to say, you got your percentiles, but were those statistically significant and different? The answer is yes. So in fact, for this client, we found, you know what? Minorities are actually significantly more engaged than non-minorities. Now, I will tell you that the client was surprised at this, and I think a lot of people that we've spoken to were surprised by this. And so what that enabled us to do, though, was to dig a little bit deeper. And so with that information, we said, well, let's see what else is going on. Right now we have a general area of focus, but maybe there's a little bit more going on. Maybe we can dig a little bit deeper to understand the context to see what's truly driving these differences in engagement scores. And by doing so, we actually found that, now remember I told you that age was going to be, that was a little bit of foreshadowing. We looked at millennials versus non-millennials. And as you can see here, millennials are significantly lower in their engagement for this client than non-millennials. And although you can see that there are still minority, non-minority differences, a lot of this gap that's going on is really related to that generation. And so had we not dove a little bit deeper into that data to understand what's going on with those areas in that context, then we might not have been able to identify what's truly impacting this client's engagement scores and enabling them to drive the action planning with a little bit more detail and understanding, so that they are really getting at the crux of what will make a change in their engagement in their organization.
So Michelle, I'm hearing a few things. First, I hear that while demographics and our personal demographics can be a predictor and driver of engagement, it sounds like at least 3 of the top 5 drivers of engagement were actually cultural elements of the culture of the organization. And then I also hear that as we look at the personal identifiers, the personal demographics, minority status was a predictor. However, it seems as though the age difference and age gap seems to be the greatest driver and predictor of levels of engagement.
Absolutely. That is absolutely what we found. Thank you, Zach. And now again, reminding you that this is with this client specifically. And that's what's so important about digging into your own data, is because your data may be very different. But yes, that was our finding with this client. And so once we identified exactly what you were just speaking to, Zach, those differences there, instead of continuing to delve deeper into that minority, non-minority difference in order to drive change, we now identified where to truly drive change at, or where to focus in on, which is age or generational differences. And so what that led us to was then doing analysis to say, okay, we know that millennials and non-millennials are important, and there's different things happening here. Particularly, we need to focus on millennials because there's really some problems going on there. And so what we were able to do is then look at that data and say, how is culture relating to or driving engagement, and how does that differ between millennials and non-millennials? And so what we were able to do here is in this instance, what we did was take the top 10 drivers. So essentially what we're doing is, out of all of the cultural elements in that culture context that Dan spoke to, what are the areas that are the most impactful for this client, to this organization when it comes to engagement? And not just for this client when it comes to engagement, but more specifically delving into, well, what is most important for non-millennials and what is most important for millennials? And you can see here, when in this table, we have listed the top 10 for each, and then if an item is not in the top 10 for, let's say, non-millennials, then it has its ranking as compared to the other group, so that we can see how high that item is ranked as far as the strength with which it drives engagement. And so what we can do here, how we can use this, is again getting back to that idea of knowing about engagement, understanding how there are differences between non-millennials and millennials is absolutely important. But what's going to help us do something about that is taking a step before that, understanding the culture and where we can implement change and drive our action planning to make changes.
Really interesting, Michelle. So it sounds like no matter your age, having a vision that creates excitement and motivation, giving people meaning and direction in their work, is going to be a driver of engagement, no matter your age. But it also sounds like millennials in particular are really being driven by the opportunity to learn and develop professionally. Absolutely.
And that actually goes perfectly along with what we see overall when it comes to engagement. We tend to see that core values is very important when we think about engagement overall across different contexts. And again, we also see that vision is a tendency across different contexts. So it's exciting to see and encouraging to see that this is important here for both non-millennials and millennials. But as you emphasize, there do seem to be those distinctions where, for this instance in this organization, that idea of involvement and empowerment were standing out a little bit more for millennials, and that was something that the organization needed to focus on in order to hopefully drive some real change in those scores, to keep to increase their millennial engagement, and hopefully by doing so also increase their non-millennial engagement, because of course we want everybody to be engaged. By no means do we want to ignore any group, but this helps us focus in on the areas that we're truly concerned about and we see as serious risk factors today. Okay. This is one example of looking and delving deeper into the engagement scores of a client. And so what we're trying to get at, and what Dan has been alluding to and talking about, is really figuring out, not just looking at that outcome, not just looking at how people feel about things, but looking at how did we get there? What can we do to change that? And so what we can do is focus in on those key components, like I just showed you, and in that previous example, to drive changes in engagement. And so this next example that I'm going to show you is an example of how we can truly delve into the data and understand what is the context and the relationship across the whole organization. Now, in this example, it's actually talking about trust. However, as we know and think about trust is exceptionally important when you think about engagement. You need to have trust in the organization to have high engagement. So these are very highly related outcomes, and both of them are going to be important when you look at the whole relationship looking throughout all the context within the organization. And so this is an example of how we can really delve into the data to understand not just the outcome, but again, what is driving that? How are we getting there? And this is also a great preview for the webinar in June, because we'll be talking about leadership and culture in a bit more depth then. So in this instance, what we were able to do is look at when you take leadership competencies and culture into consideration at the same time and how they impact trust. What is the relationship that's going on there? How are those working together to drive perceptions of trust? Well, in this case, we found that if you consider both leadership competencies and culture, well, you can account for, in this case, 55% of perceptions of trust. That's huge. We can account for, in this case, a huge, huge proportion of this very critical outcome, trust, when you take into account both leadership and culture. And for this particular instance, we verified the relationships to understand that in order for leaders to drive change in trust or an outcome of importance, this is done through culture. So the best way for leaders to drive change in trust is through their impact on culture. And so we were able to delve, and not just understand this model, but we were able to delve even deeper into that concept to be able to drive some action planning and understanding about where to focus in on to make some significant changes in this important outcome. And so for this instance, for this client, we looked and we identified that when it comes to culture, the trait of consistency, and particularly core values, was the key focal area for them to be able to drive change in trust. And additionally, in order to drive change in core values, what they needed to focus on was training their leaders in the empowers people, and more generally in the involvement trait, but specifically the empowers people trait. By doing this, we were able to identify the specific areas within the cultural context and within the leadership that the client could use to truly make a change in this outcome that is really important. You know, as Dan talked about, in this case, trust, which is highly related to commitment and engagement. And all three of these are all very, very related to employee performance, which of course is related to firm performance, as well as, of course, important things such as turnover. And so we are able to delve even deeper in and identify not just the core areas to focus in, but additionally the specific leader behaviors to focus in on to drive changes in the culture that matters most for this outcome, and to make changes not only in that cultural, but also finally that trust outcome, which is important for making true changes and stepping up the ladder to improve employee perceptions of the organization. And so this is just an example, of course, as I mentioned, of ways that it exemplifies how important it is to truly delve deep into what is going on in this organization. We know that in this case, example, trust, but we were focusing in on engagement. We know that engagement is important. We know that it can be driven by different cultural elements, and in fact as well, leadership elements. But what's important is to dive into those factors and understand what is the link. If we make a change here, if we action plan to drive change in core values, if we action plan and work on developing our leaders in the area of empowers people, how do we expect to see the changes in our outcomes that matter most to us and most to our organization and our people? Okay.
One of the other things that we've seen that's really interesting in other clients taking a similar approach to what Michelle's described is how often we enter into a discussion with a client where, as you saw from these examples, they're extremely concerned about the diversity and inclusion issues, and that it's most of their concern is driven by differences that they perceive in race and gender. The results that Michelle shared with us today are pretty unusual because there's several other clients where we've looked at the engagement gap by minority status, and we found that that minorities were less engaged. But the interesting part about this is how granular you often need to get to see the real answer. We saw this gap in engagement between men and women, and we went through this in a very thorough, rigorous way. And what we started to find is that, there are some big differences by country. Location counts, and in ways that you might expect. Some of the European countries in this one organization, Belgium in particular, did have higher engagement scores among women than among men. Other cultures, several in Asia, pretty strongly the other way around, where women reported much lower engagement scores. But then we decided to take a closer look, because this client organization had multiple locations within each country. And that was what really was insightful and was interesting, because the range that we saw within each country, went from kind of a positive gap to a negative gap. In some locations, women were more highly engaged than men. In others, it was the other way around. On balance, at the aggregate level, men were slightly more engaged than women. But the picture that a culture gets created at a pretty local level, at a plant level, an office level, and that's the strongest driver of the engagement scores, was a picture that came out loud and clear to us and to the client. And it was very actionable, because what they could then do is look at the leadership style, the management practices, the culture in each of their locations, because that was what was driving the gender gap in engagement. And oh, by the way, as Michelle's presentation showed, the gap between millennials and non-millennials was 3 or 4 times as large as the gap between men and women. And initially, in several clients, I've had the experience of them being initially kind of disappointed, because they didn't find that the race or gender issues and diversity that they're very tuned into, as they should be, extremely important issues. But initially, they were kind of disappointed, because they saw that the differences in age far overshadowed the differences in race and gender, and also the culture differences by location had a much bigger impact. But interesting process, because after having a little bit of time to think about that, they saw pretty clearly that building the capability of the team, building the capability of the leaders, location by location, maybe starting with some of the locations that were struggling the most, and maybe drawing on some of those locations that had practices, values, and people that created a positive culture, that was a path forward, that they could drive change, and they could learn as they would go along. So, we've had a real interesting journey these last couple of years on the issue of how culture and engagement connect. And again, what we're finding is that engagement still is extremely important. No question about that at all. But how do you impact that? What are the levers that you pull? What are the areas where you place your focus, place your concentration in order to improve engagement and to improve the performance of the business. That means you have to take a step back. You have to look at the context. You have to look at the culture because those are some of the strongest influences on those important behavioral outcomes like engagement and trust, but also on the performance of the business. So those are some of the stories that we're hearing on the road, and wanted to share those with you today and get some of your thoughts and reactions, and follow up with you with a copy of this presentation so that you've got our recent thoughts. And there's also a couple of articles that we can include on this theme as well. Anyway, so I guess back to Zach. Zach, do we have any questions coming in from the audience today? Or are there any themes that you'd like us to speak to a bit more?
So nothing coming in through the chat function, which means I think you guys did an excellent job. If any do come up in the next few minutes, please let us know. I just wanted to, for now, preview what our next steps in this journey of partnership look like. Thanks so much for joining us today. Thanks to Dan and Michelle for hosting. The video of this recording will go up on the website. If you think it would be valuable for anyone on your team or any of your clients, please feel free to share it. Next month in June, we'll be discussing how culture and leadership together can become incredibly powerful drivers of change. So how do we actually take our tools and assessments in leadership and culture and really implement them into a process that helps your clients manage change? We'll also be sending out a pulse survey through our pulse platform called Waggle to help solicit more topics that you'd like to hear throughout the year. We want to make sure that we curate our content in our consulting webinar series to topics that you find interesting, to topics that your clients need to hear about. And with that, we will also, of course, always be taking direct feedback questions, which can come in through me. My email address is there. Again, Zach Ackerman, our Director of Business Development. With that, we'll take a quick 30-second pause. If we don't get any questions, we'll give you the next 8 minutes of your day back, and we really, really appreciate you joining us. And here's one. What is the key message for clients who have just completed an engagement survey but haven't yet done a culture survey, particularly if they are concerned about overloading their staff?
Good question, because the overload is always an issue. Well, I think the key to getting value from any survey process is action, and I think that one of the dilemmas with a engagement only approach is it's not very actionable. It's a bit like the temperature, versus the weather report. The analysis of the culture is going to tell you some of the things that are coming, whereas engagement just kind of tells you what the temperature is today, and that I think one of the steps is the recognition of how difficult it is to act on engagement results. One client that we work with did extensive effort after engagement to do dozens of focus groups trying to search for some actionable points. That was very time consuming. It's probably more time consuming than doing the survey itself. And in the end, most of their recommendations came back to kind of the employment relation, were kind of HR action points, and it really did not look that actionable to the line leaders in the organization. So, I think that the thing that we see that drives this forward is when people aspire to more and they understand that in order to solve this problem, they do have to go deeper. I think the other part of this is to try to get a client organization to look at the time and effort involved in doing a survey versus taking action on the survey. And taking action is much more time consuming than is just taking the survey. At Denison Consulting, we actually take our own medicine once in a while, believe it or not. And when, we do know how to set up surveys, and so sure, we can do that in a few days, and people take 15, 20 minutes, each, and yeah, that's an investment of time. But that drives our improvement process. That drives our discussions for weeks, for months, each year, as it helps us focus our attention on the key areas of intervention where we think we can best make an impact. So trying to cultivate the interest in doing more is always a key point. And, bringing out our research on how culture is what the research shows is most likely to have an impact on business performance. Those are some of the ways that we try to make the case for going deeper. The other part of it is that these two efforts can be combined. There's no real reason why a culture and an engagement survey need to be two different surveys or two different things. In some client organizations, they are. But even in those, we really try hard to have one cycle of action that, even though there's the two data inputs of the culture data and the engagement data. But the best way is to just include them. And, our engagement module is a part of many of our projects, and we'll make sure that all of you get that too, so that you can see the questions that we ask and the type of output that we provide.
That's great. And I would just add, as we close in these last few minutes, I think one of the best analogies I've ever heard actually come from a client who was processing themselves the difference between culture and engagement. It was an executive in a pizza company. The COO, it finally clicked, and he said, "Oh, this is like when we ask our customers, do they like the pizza or not? And if they get a lot of feedback that no, the pizza tastes bad, that would be the equivalent of a low engagement score. But what we now need to do to improve the flavor of the pizza is to change the recipe. And the recipe is culture. So like they would with their customers, if they only knew the pizza was good or bad, they'd have to follow up with focus groups to understand what about the flavor was good or bad and how that would impact the recipe. And those focus groups are something that usually have to come out of an engagement survey. Focus groups can be expensive for your clients, which may be a benefit for you if you're the one facilitating them, but they are resource intensive. And I think your goal can help be to make the case for why culture and engagement together is so critical. But if you are engaged in doing focus groups, the Denison model is free. The Denison model is a terrific framework and shared language to discuss culture in the context of engagement in culture. And so as you do facilitate focus groups, mapping that feedback to the Denison model can be a fantastic segue into showing that value and showing that it all links back to the work environment, to the culture of the organization, which can be a great way to open the door down the road for doing a full culture and engagement survey together and having the benefit of both the flavor of the pizza and the recipe.
That's great. Thank you, Zach. And thanks to all of you for joining us today. We'll be back in touch, and we look forward to talking with you again soon.
Take care.